Welcome to Counsel Culture, the Business of Law podcast brought to you by Byfield.
Welcome to Counsel Culture, the Business of Law podcast from Byfield. Regular listeners will have spotted or heard by now that I am not the regular host. Olivia, our host, is sending herself on holiday this week. So we have a middle-aged dad special edition, or a dadcast. I'm Ben Girdlestone, Joint Managing Director here at Byfield, and I'm joined by Michael Evans, my fellow Managing Director. Hi, Michael. How are you doing?
Hey, Ben. Yeah, good to be doing the centrist dad edition. We haven't done one for a while, I think.
We haven't. And then with all the economic and political mayhem going on, perhaps we will be the voice of calm. So I think we will start with the seismic news yesterday of the trade deal which the UK and the US have agreed. Don't worry, listeners, you're not about to get a bunch of economic analysis from underqualified people, but I think it is worth us having taking a small step back and feeling, I think, relatively encouraged by the fact that a deal has happened. Not necessarily one of any particular consequence from an economic or a business perspective, but definitely from an optics perspective. My own view is the fact that the US is favourable towards the UK surely has to be good news for when we do try and cut more deals, such as the one we cut with India this week, or any others. Will look as if we're open for business. And for the legal sector, has to be a good thing. I don't know what you think, Michael.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think, look, it's just bringing a little bit of stability, and it's not really about the economic consequences, because it's a pretty thin deal. It's just, again, the optics of being the first ones to do a deal, whatever you think about this whole tariff stuff. Globalization may not be completely dead, just taking on a slightly more transactional form. And it just means that people can sort of get on with things without too much change. Although I must admit, I'm quite keen, I'm quite happy that we don't have to, eat, chlorinated chicken and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, US, I love the US, as people know, but US food in particular, the food and the vegetables are full of hormones, aren't they? So I'm quite glad that we are not going to be subject to too much of that. Anyway, moving swiftly on, we're recording this early on Friday morning, which is very good timing because the lawyer have just broken what looks to be a very, very significant story that McDermott and Schulte, Roth and Zabel are to merge, a deal which Rachel Maloney has broken, which will create over $2.8 billion in turnover, which I think makes them about the size or potentially bigger than Hogan Lovells, which clearly is very significant. Now, you know a little bit about Schulte, don't you, Michael? So maybe you can inform our listeners who might not.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think they were doing, hedge funds, private capital, asset management work way before it was kind of a sexy area that everybody was making tons of cash from. I remember when I was a journalist in the I get the feeling I'm going to say that more and more as I get older. Back when I was a journalist in the early 2000s or mid 2000s, I remember going to interview somebody there, and it was really confusing because I'd got the hang of navigating the City of London by sort of law firm offices. I could, I could practically find my way to the Linklater's offices blindfolded. And then I had to go to Savile Row because they were like upstairs in the building on Savile Row at the time. And I was like, why is there a law firm here? And, they were saying, oh, well, they hadn't, I can't remember if they'd only just opened in London, but I really remember because it was just completely different. And they were saying, well, there are hedge funds here. Why do we want to be over in the City of London? We don't work with banks, we work with hedge funds. And they've always been very different in that respect. Obviously, in the intervening years, it's become that private capital, private funds, asset management, hedge fund work has become hugely lucrative and has driven a lot of the growth of some of the world's biggest law firms. And so it's kind of interesting that they're doing this deal. They might be sort of under the radar, but they're serious players in that space. it's the sort of thing which would see a big international full service firm like McDermott bolting on or merging. I don't want to say it's a bolt on because, merger of equals and all that. But if it does happen, it adds very significant heft in an area which is, it's highly profitable, and a player that has been, doing this and knows the market pretty much better than anybody. So, interesting move. It'll be interesting to see what the strategic drivers are for it if it turns out to be accurate and as more comes out. I wouldn't be able to speculate beyond that. But what we are seeing, I think, or hearing on the sort of grapevine is that there's a lot of merge talks going on at the moment in the US, and we're going to see more combinations in the coming months. I mean, certainly that's what I've heard. I mean, what about you, Ben? Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do, and I circle back to the Kramer Herbert Smith Freehills deals, and there are a significant number of firms which we in this market are not that familiar with, who have got heft, who have got presences in London and want to grow them. I'm looking at some details on Schulte as we speak. They've got 13 partners in Piccadilly. Probably in the same office that you visited, which is significant. Yeah, they are. They're significantly smaller than the McDermott. I think the turnover was something like 618 million, and the total turnover of the combined firms will be 2.8 billion. So do the maths. But I think it is. I think it's super exciting. I also think that the effect on the US market in London, as in US firms in London, will be significant. What we could see is, that US 50 report, which the lawyer is just publishing this month, could look very different in 2 years, couldn't it? If this continues, which I think is quite exciting. You could have you could have some very different firms in there, with some firms dropping out and others coming in. So yes, I hope that more deals happen because we all like change and things, don't we? Good. Okay, so moving on, we I did try and keep this a Trump-free zone for 1 week, but I think we're going to slightly struggle with that, not least because we've seen quite a lot of detailed analysis over the last week or so around firms that have, cut deals with Trump on that original list of 20 or whatever it was. Some analysis of how those firms may fare in the middle, sort of a few years down the track, particularly if the Democrats come back in, and particularly some rumors of unrest within those firms of associates and partners, perhaps looking to move on, uncomfortable what their firms have done, or equally perhaps just kind of grumbling a little bit and deciding to stay. I got some news on this, Michael, but I'm going to hand over to you a little bit to hear from you first.
Sure. I mean, thanks, Ben. It's There's no getting away from the fact that it's impossible for any extended conversation to be a Trump-free zone at the moment, which I guess is kind of what he wanted, really. Whether it's friends, family, colleagues, whether it's in a work context, private, personal context, that's how it is in 2025. I think it's undoubtedly the biggest story of the year and continues to be as the sort of aftershocks reverberate around. And I think it's interesting that it's litigators, the story that you're referring to talks about litigators, there being some potential moves, and obviously the legal press, wider business press, are very interested in this. You've seen the big piece in 60 Minutes, wasn't it? The special edition 60 Minutes on Trump and law firms, others. So there's been a lot on this. There's been articles about how clients may be responding and dealing with it, some implications about clients changing firms or not offering opportunities. Look, I'm not in the room. We don't know how real all of that is. Some things are determined by what happens at the margins, and some things are not. Something is determined by, does it really turn into a bigger change than sort of just some sort of fringe cases at the margins of things. And at the moment, what we're seeing is, things at the margins, a handful of departures, a handful of resignations, a handful of potential, client or rumblings. But it's not squarely in the sort of the core of firms' businesses, and that may be where it stays. I don't know. You have to, but I think if the story is going to continue to kind of rumble on, and of course, you know, there's a lot of opposition in this and a lot of disagreement, which means, of course, that the legal press and media more broadly will continue to pick at it because of that, because by definition, that's what makes it newsworthy. People are disagreeing with each other, things are happening, and it will provide lots and lots of stories going forward. So, I mean, what's the news that you've got to share, Ben?
So I've got a couple of observations. The first thing that strikes me is whenever, cutting a deal with Trump is a huge thing for a firm to do. And whenever firms do anything huge, usually there's lobbying and a voting process and all this sort of stuff, right? Over a series of weeks and months, and there's a lot of, consultation, etc. I am interested into what the process was within all these firms that led to them doing that, and how do you build a coalition of the willing? So no wonder there are some dissenting voices, because I'm sure there must have been some unilateral stuff going on with by a firm leadership and normal process not being followed, because it just couldn't be. So that's one observation, which is interesting, which is why I think we're getting some fallout. The second is, I would have thought that there is probably, not to generalize, but a difference in views between transactional and litigation lawyers. If you're a transactional lawyer, you're just a practical person, aren't you? And you want to get the deal done. But if you are a litigator, then the optics of making deals with an administration and not necessarily being seen to fight, and being in a position where, if you're involved in a case which for whatever reason is, your client is at slightly odds with wherever the administration is heading, what is your credibility going to be in terms of advising clients? So I think those couple of points for me are quite interesting. But I think the first one is, you haven't seen too much about that, but firms have made deals very quickly. So the first discussion about doing so to actually doing a deal, from an outside observers, can be a matter of days, really. And law firms do not do things quickly because they tend to be very conciliatory internally. So I think there'll be some friction there.
Yeah, of course. And but I think the second point is really important. And I think there was one thing where, if we think about a couple of weeks ago, there was the deal signed between the US and Ukraine relating to minerals and natural resources, which I believe you had Hogan Lovells acting for the government of Ukraine on that. And that's an example of something where literally a firm, it's hard to see how a firm doing a deal with the federal government would have been able to continue to do that work, for example, because it would have been it would feel like a clear conflict, because you've done a deal with the people who are on the other side of a major piece of work. So, I mean, that's kind of an extreme example, but I'm sure there are others where, if you've got a big company that's constantly in opposition to federal agencies or whatever, scrutiny from federal government, it may be difficult. But again, that is in a contentious context, which is different from that transactional mindset which you talked about. But I do think that it would be interesting to see something which explored a little bit more. There's been sort of people talking about potential conflicts or whatever, but articulating a bit more clearly what that might look like. I mean, like I said, I'm sort of using the Ukraine-US natural resources deal as just because that seems like an obvious one, but I haven't seen a huge amount exploring what in reality might pose a conflict.
Yeah, agreed. So I think, much to all our listeners' relief, we're going to move away from politics now and focus on a couple of one domestic story, or a couple of stories which are linked. FT reported this week that a number of mid-tier firms are increasing bonuses for juniors who perhaps work longer hours or bill more hours. But yet Ron on Friday this morning is reporting that Linklaters is removing elements of bonus which apply to billable hours, so they're almost doing the opposite. Let's just get a quick view from you on that.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Again, we're talking about opposition, but this is stories pretty much on the same day, like showing
Yeah.
completely different approaches to. That's relatively unusual in the legal sector because people will copy each other, right?
Yes, yeah.
Generally speaking, it's not known for going down like different directions all the time. So it in terms of the FT piece, which Susie Ring wrote, which lists out a range of different firms having, rewarding lawyers for more hours, more work. It's framed it in the context of finding ways to compete with firms that just have got deeper pockets. So that's on the one hand, and I think the Linklaters one is a bit more of a kind of reflection, I suppose, of. I don't know. I mean, the Linklaters one. What do you think? What do you think's happening there?
Maybe it's a work-life balance thing. I don't know. I think Linklaters are on a really interesting position, aren't they, from a US perspective, given what Freshfields are doing there. For me, it's a bit of a curate's egg. I'm not quite sure what to really make of it, to be honest. Particularly in a week where I think Slaughters have held firm on their NQ salaries, haven't they? And not pushing them up. So you're almost seeing a sort of heritage, and I use that word deliberately, magic circle firms, sort of slightly sticking to their guns in terms of not throwing too much money at things. And maybe some of the political stuff and some of the unhappiness that some associates have shown at US firms, they're thinking, well, do you know what? The culture at our firms is a bit different, isn't it? So whatever is going on with Trump and the effect that's happening for morale within the associate basis of the big US firms, maybe the sort of heritage magic circle and silver circle firms are feeling a bit emboldened by that. Maybe there's some of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think like what's interesting is the fact that like the FT piece is firms confirming they're doing things, announcing things in
Yeah.
terms of more incentivization. While the Linklaters piece is one of those classic Roll on Friday pieces where, they've obviously got some information. There's no formal comment from a firm. There's some internal sources. There's some speculation that there have been some changes to comp where in fact there are still billable. There's still very big bonuses available for people who really smash the targets and do like 2,500 hours, etc. So it's a bit harder to tell what exactly is there. So that feels more kind of like a sort of a one-off situation rather than a trend. Whereas the firms upping upping bonuses for reaching certain targets feels a bit more like a market trend, and that's kind of interesting. Just greater incentivization, but it does run counter to. It's going to be interesting with the sort of AI revolution incoming and more use of technological tools which can actually deliver in a way which we think about machine learning and all of that. When a lot of AI and legal chat were like 5 years ago, 7 years ago, it wasn't really AI. It was machine learning. It was automating a certain relatively simple tasks. Whereas now you've got tools that genuinely can do quite advanced elements of professional work to a pretty high standard and really can deliver short, like speed up things. So, there's a bit of a collision coming between, the way things were done, the amount of resource you needed to do things, and those technological tools. Which is going to materially start to play out from now and over the next few years, probably to the extent that aspects of the legal market will genuinely look quite different in 2 to 4 years, because we are kind of at that tipping point where there are things that technology can genuinely facilitate and to an extent do through AI, which wouldn't even been dreamed of 6 or 7 years ago.
Yeah, I think I think that's right. Right, just conscious of time, so we're going to move on to our final story, which I love Law.com's uh, rankings that they do occasionally of up and coming partners, private equity stars, all this. I love them for two reasons. I think the main one is that we all know who the superstars are, or your Neil Sachdevs and others are around, deals and things. But it's just great when you can see the kind of the stars of the future. Um, the other thing I like, and the one I'm going to refer to this week, is the one which came out, I think, late yesterday or early this morning at law.com. Rising Stars, the European legal industry's best up and coming women 2025. So they've ranked the top 25 women under 40 in firms across continental Europe and Ireland. And it's a really good read and a really good list. It's just going back to the kind of umbrella theme of the podcast in the last few weeks, we do feel as if we're in this transatlantic corridor, don't we, at the moment? And it's really nice to be reminded that, the European markets are really, really vibrant. We've heard a lot about Paris, and to a lesser extent Milan, but there's some really good work and some really good independent firms in some of those, well, all of those countries. And it's refreshing, I think, to read about them, and to see tomorrow's talent, and for once just to get away from this sort of slightly intense transatlantic thing that's going on at the moment. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if we were to get the US official, the government line on this, they'd be saying, where's the list of the best up and coming men?
Yeah.
But no, I completely take it, which I'm glad.
Yeah.
So, we don't have but no, I completely agree, and I think the point that you make about the talent is not all in New York and London, and sometimes the intense focus on those markets can come across a little bit like it is, which is completely inaccurate and kind of ridiculous and incredibly unfair. One of the great things that one of the really nice things that I really enjoyed working at Baker McKenzie for a long time was the fact that you got to deal with really, really smart, talented people in lots and lots of different countries. And, some of the smartest people were, you'd get somebody in Dusseldorf who was, obviously a future leader of the firm. You'd get unbelievably smart people in Brussels. You'd get great people in, Barcelona, and whether they were both great lawyers, but also sort of great leaders. And I think these kinds of articles, yes, you have a lens. You're looking at women, you're looking at up and coming women, but it's also about that jurisdictional recognition that there is stuff going on, really good stuff going on, done by fantastic lawyers in a range of big markets and economies, and Amsterdam, Luxembourg, etc. And we don't hear those stories. We don't see those people anywhere near as much as we should because of this relentless focus that we have on US and London. So I think, I agree with you. It's a good thing. More of it, please.
Good. Well, I think that probably rounds us off for this week. Nice to be reminded there's a big world out there. So thanks everyone for listening. Olivia will be back hosting next week. Have a good weekend and a good week next week.
You've been listening to Counsel Culture, the Business of Law podcast brought to you by Byfield. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and join us again next week, where we'll be discussing some more of the biggest stories in the legal sector.